morning sun had just started to warm the narrow streets of the small town. But for one child, the day already felt heavy. Life had never been easy. Every simple task that most people didn't even think about, moving from one place to another, getting ready for school, or even stepping outside, came with effort, patience, and sometimes quiet pain. The child lived with a single parent in a small, worn-out house at the edge of the town. The house wasn't much, but it was filled with care. The parent worked long hours just to make sure there was food on the table and a roof over their heads. Even then, things were tight. There were no extra comforts, no luxuries, only the basics, and sometimes not even that. Despite everything, the child rarely complained. Each morning followed a slow routine. The parent would gently help the child into an old wheelchair that had clearly seen better days. Its wheels made a faint grinding sound, and one side always felt slightly off balance. It had been repaired many times using whatever tools and materials were available, but it was never truly fixed. Still, it was all they had. The road to school was not far, but it felt long. The uneven ground made every push harder. Small stones, cracks, and broken paths turned into obstacles. Sometimes the parent would push the chair. Other days, the child insisted on trying alone, even if it took longer. There was a quiet determination in those moments, a desire not to feel like a burden. At school, things were not always easy either. The other children didn't always understand. Some stared, some whispered, a few tried to be kind, but most simply kept their distance. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was more like they didn't know what to say or how to act, so they said nothing at all. During breaks, while others ran and laughed in the open yard, the child stayed near the side, watching. There was no anger in those eyes, only a quiet longing, a wish to be part of something so simple, yet so far away. But even then, the child held on to small moments of happiness. A kind word from a teacher, a shared smile, a gentle breeze on a warm day. These little things mattered more than anyone realized. One afternoon, after school had ended, the sky looked slightly darker than usual, as if it was unsure whether to rain or not. The child began the journey back home alone. The parent had been called into work early that day and couldn't come. The road felt longer than usual. Halfway home, something happened. There was a sharp, sudden sound. A crack followed by a rough scraping noise. The wheelchair tilted to one side, and the child quickly grabbed onto the armrest to avoid falling. One of the wheels had come loose. It didn't fall off completely, but it was no longer stable enough to move. The child tried to push forward gently, but the chair refused to cooperate. Each small movement made it worse. After a few attempts, it became clear. The wheelchair wasn't going anywhere. For a moment, everything felt still. Cars passed by. People walked along the road. A few glanced in that direction, noticing something was wrong, but no one stopped. Some were in a hurry. Others probably assumed someone else would help. And a few simply looked away, unsure of what to do. The child sat there quietly, hands resting on the worn-out armrests, eyes fixed on the ground. There was no shouting, no crying, just silence. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. A light breeze moved through the air, carrying dust along the roadside. The sky grew a little darker. The child's hands tightened slightly, not out of anger, but from a feeling that had become familiar over time. A mix of helplessness and quiet patience. Then, from across the road, a different kind of sound could be heard. It was the steady tapping of metal tools, the soft hum of a machine, and the faint clinking of parts being moved around. It came from a small roadside workshop that most people barely noticed as they passed by. The workshop was simple. Its walls were rough, the roof slightly uneven, and the ground was covered in bits of metal, tools, and old machine parts. It wasn't clean or organized, but it had its own kind of order, one that only the person working there understood. Inside, a mechanic was busy working on an old motorbike. His clothes were marked with grease, and his hands showed signs of years of hard work. There was nothing special about his appearance, nothing that made him stand out in a crowd. But there was a calm focus in the way he worked, steady, patient, and careful. As he adjusted a part on the motorbike, something caught his attention. It wasn't a loud sound or a call for help. It was the stillness. He looked up and noticed the child sitting by the roadside, the broken wheelchair slightly tilted. For a moment he paused, observing quietly. Then, without hesitation, he put his tools down. He wiped his hands on a cloth and stepped out of the workshop. There was no rush in his walk, but there was purpose. He crossed the road carefully and approached the child. Up close, he could see the problem clearly. The wheel was loose, and part of the frame looked bent. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't make it a big moment. He simply said, in a calm and gentle tone, "Looks like it needs fixing." The child looked up, a little surprised, unsure of what to expect. Most people didn't stop, but this man had. There was a brief moment of silence, then a small nod. That was enough. The mechanic carefully examined the wheelchair, turning it slightly to understand the damage. His movements were slow and thoughtful, as if he was already planning how to fix it. After a few seconds, he stood up and looked toward his workshop. "It won't move like this," he said simply. "Let's get it over there." He didn't wait for an answer. Gently, he lifted the front part of the wheelchair and began guiding it toward the workshop, making sure the child was steady and comfortable. The distance wasn't far, but something about that moment felt important. For the first time that day, the child wasn't stuck. As they reached the workshop, the mechanic cleared a small space and positioned the wheelchair carefully. He moved a few tools aside, creating room to work. The place smelled of oil and metal, but it felt safe. The child watched quietly as the mechanic knelt down and began inspecting the wheel more closely. His hands moved with experience, checking each part, tightening, adjusting, thinking. There was no frustration in his expression, only focus. From time to time, he would glance up and offer a small, reassuring smile, as if to say, "Don't worry, it'll be okay." Outside, the sky finally began to change, and a few drops of rain started to fall. Inside the workshop, however, something else had already begun. Not just a repair, but the start of something that neither of them fully understood yet. The child didn't know how much this moment would matter, and the mechanic, in his simple way, probably didn't think it was anything special at all. To him, it was just a small act, just helping fix something that was broken. But sometimes, the smallest moments are the ones that change everything. The child sat quietly on a small stool in the workshop, eyes fixed on the mechanic's hands as they moved with careful precision over the wheelchair. The air smelled of oil, metal, and something faintly earthy from the workshop floor, but it was strangely comforting. Every tool the mechanic picked up seemed to have its place, and every movement had a purpose. The child watched, fascinated, and for the first time that day, a small spark of hope flickered inside. The mechanic didn't rush. He examined the wheelchair from every angle, twisting and turning it to see which parts were damaged. The wheel was loose, yes, but the frame underneath had been bent for a long time. It wasn't going to be a simple fix. He muttered to himself softly, almost like he was talking to the chair. "You've seen better days, haven't you?" The child smiled a little. It was strange to hear someone speak to the wheelchair like it was a person. But there was something kind in his voice, a warmth that made the child feel safe. No one had ever treated their broken chair with such care. Usually, adults would hurry, push the chair back home, and say, "Be careful." But this man was different. He went to a shelf cluttered with old tools and spare parts. His hands moved confidently, picking up a small wrench, a hammer, and a few pieces of metal. The child noticed how precise he was. He didn't just tighten the wheel. He looked at the frame, the spokes, the bolts. Every part mattered. Every movement was deliberate. The mechanic began to speak, though not directly to the child at first. "This wheel is old. The screws have loosened, and the frame is bent. But we can fix it." He smiled faintly. "It might even work better than before." The child's eyes widened. Could it really become better? They had been used to struggling, to the creaking and tilting of the old chair. The thought that it might become easier to use was almost too good to believe. The mechanic worked patiently. He replaced the loose screws, bent the metal back into place, and adjusted the wheel so it moved more smoothly. Every now and then, he would pause, check his work, and nod to himself. The child watched closely, noticing how calm he was, how careful. There was no hurry, no sign of frustration, just quiet determination. As he worked, he occasionally spoke to the child. "You must have used this chair for a long time, huh?" The child nodded. "It's not easy, I know, but we'll make it better." His voice was soft, almost fatherly, without being overbearing. The child felt a strange sense of trust growing. This was someone who genuinely wanted to help, not just do a favor or get recognition. The rain outside grew heavier, but inside the workshop, time seemed to slow. The sound of raindrops tapping on the roof mixed with the soft clinking of tools created a rhythm almost like music. The child felt strangely calm, almost as if they could sit there forever, watching the mechanic work. After a while, he stepped back and examined the chair again. It looked the same on the outside, but the child noticed the difference immediately. The wheels moved more smoothly. The chair felt sturdier, more balanced. The old creaking sound was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady glide. It was a small miracle in its own way. The mechanic smiled faintly. "Try it now," he said. The child carefully sat back in the wheelchair, hands gripping the armrests. With a gentle push, the chair moved forward. It rolled easily, smoothly, and almost as if it had a new life. The child's eyes lit up, a smile spreading across their face. They went back and forth a few times, laughing softly, feeling a sense of freedom they hadn't experienced in a long time. "It's wonderful," the child whispered, barely believing it. "Thank you." The mechanic waved his hand casually. "It's nothing, just a small fix. Anyone could have done it." But the child could see the pride in his eyes. He cared more than he let on, and that made the child feel even more grateful. For the first time that day, the child felt a little lighter, a little freer. The struggle to move around, which had always seemed like a burden, suddenly felt easier. There was still work to be done at home, still a long path to school, but it didn't feel impossible anymore. The small act of kindness had changed something fundamental. It had restored hope. The parent arrived a little later, breathless from work. They had been worried, rushing from the office as fast as possible when they realized the child hadn't come home on time. Seeing the wheelchair, seeing the child smiling and moving freely, tears filled their eyes. They rushed forward, embracing the child, and then looked at the mechanic with gratitude that words could hardly express. The mechanic simply shook his head. "It was nothing," he said. "I just fixed it." But the parent insisted. "No, you don't understand. This is more than nothing. You've made their life easier. You've given them freedom. You've helped more than you know." The mechanic smiled quietly. He didn't argue. He had seen people struggle all his life. He had helped many in small ways without seeking recognition. To him, this was just another day. But to the child and the parent, it was monumental. It was life-changing. As they left the workshop, the child testing the chair carefully, the mechanic returned to his workbench. He picked up a small wrench, adjusted a few more things, and continued fixing an old bike. But he felt a quiet satisfaction, a warmth that stayed with him. He might never see the full impact of what he had done, but somehow he knew it mattered. That evening, as the sun began to set and the rain stopped, the child sat by the window, turning the wheels of the chair back and forth. It moved so easily now. Every push was smooth, every turn effortless. They felt like they could go anywhere, do anything. And deep down, they understood something important. Someone had cared enough to make their life better, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The mechanic's simple act of kindness had opened a new door. It was more than just a fixed chair. It was a chance at confidence, independence, and hope. The child began to dream a little bigger, imagining places they could go, things they could do, and the life they could live. It was a quiet revolution in their heart, a shift that no one else could see but them. And in that small workshop, the mechanic continued his work, unaware of the lasting change he had set in motion. For him, it was just another day, just another repair. But for the child, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. The simple help, given without expectation, had changed everything. It had given freedom, joy, and hope, gifts far greater than the act itself. The night came, and the town settled into silence. Inside the small house, the child went to bed, wheels safely tucked away, and slept with a feeling they hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet, unshakable hope that tomorrow would be easier, brighter, and full of possibility. And somewhere, in a small workshop filled with tools and old metal, a mechanic continued to work, not knowing that his small hands had done something enormous. It was a simple act. But sometimes, simple acts have the power to change lives forever. The morning sun filtered through the small bedroom window, casting soft light across the floor. The child sat in the wheelchair, turning the wheels slowly, feeling the difference that the mechanic's hands had made. The chair moved so smoothly now, almost like it had a life of its own. Each push required little effort, and the familiar resistance that had made every movement a struggle was gone. For the first time in a long time, moving around didn't feel like a battle. The parent came in carrying breakfast on a tray. They paused when they saw the child's face, bright with excitement. "You're up early," they said softly. The child nodded, almost unable to speak. Words didn't seem enough to express what they felt. Instead, they simply gestured to the chair, rolling it forward a little and then back. The parent watched carefully, a smile spreading across their face. Relief, gratitude, and hope mingled in that quiet moment. "Look how smooth it is," the child said finally. "It feels different, easier." The parent knelt beside them, examining the chair. "It does," they said. "Someone really cared about you enough to make this better." They didn't know the mechanic personally, but they could see his care reflected in the repair. Every detail had been considered, the stability, the comfort, even small adjustments that made the chair easier to control. It was more than just a fix. It was a gift of independence. After breakfast, it was time to leave for school. The child carefully maneuvered the chair out of the house, testing the new freedom. The small wheels rolled effortlessly over the uneven path, and the child felt a rush of pride. For the first time, the journey didn't feel like a trial. Instead, it was an adventure, a chance to explore the world outside without fear of falling or struggling. They could go further, faster, and more confidently than ever before. Neighbors noticed the difference immediately. The child passed by houses that had once seemed intimidating. People who had barely looked before now paused, curious about the change. The wheelchair no longer creaked and wobbled. It moved with grace. Children playing in the street waved, surprised to see the child rolling past so freely. Some called out greetings, others cheered softly, and the child responded with a shy smile. It was a new kind of attention, one that wasn't pity or worry, but respect. At school, the difference was even more noticeable. Teachers watched as the child moved through the hallways with ease, arriving in class without struggle. They could participate more fully in lessons, reaching the board when needed and moving from activity to activity without constant assistance. The child felt a sense of pride and independence that had been missing for so long. Each small action, once a challenge, now felt natural and possible. During recess, the playground seemed less intimidating. The child could navigate spaces that had once felt unreachable. Friends began to notice, asking questions about the chair. "It moves so easily now," one said, amazed. The child nodded, not sure how to explain that someone's kindness had made this possible. Words felt too small for something so big, so profound. Instead, they simply smiled and shared in the joy of movement, laughing as they went over small ramps and around corners. It was a new world, opened up by a single act of care. The days that followed were filled with small victories. The child could now carry books, reach shelves, and even help classmates when needed. Independence grew step by step, wheel by wheel. Teachers remarked on the confidence that had returned. Friends began including the child in games and activities that had once seemed impossible. The wheelchair, once a source of limitation, had become a tool for freedom and participation. Back at home, the parent noticed the change as well. Mealtimes were calmer, mornings were easier, and the child seemed happier, more engaged with life. The struggles that had dominated daily routines were now smaller, more manageable. The parent often thought about the mechanic, wondering who he was and why he had cared so much. They wanted to thank him properly, but the workshop was small, tucked away, and the man was never seeking attention. His reward was simply knowing he had helped. One afternoon, curiosity overcame shyness. The child asked the parent if they could visit the mechanic's workshop to say thank you. Together, they walked to the small, cluttered space where the man worked. He looked up as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag, and offered a warm, welcoming smile. "Back again?" he asked gently. The child nodded, their heart full of gratitude. I just wanted to say thank you. It's made a big difference," they said softly. The mechanic shrugged, trying to seem casual. "I just fixed it," he said, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. He could see the change, the newfound confidence, and the joy that radiated from the child. It wasn't just about a wheelchair. It was about giving someone the chance to live more fully, to participate, to hope. The child looked around the workshop, noticing the old tools, the parts scattered across tables, and the machines waiting for repair. It was a place that seemed ordinary to most, but to the child, it felt magical. Here, someone had taken the time to care, to notice a problem, and to act. It was a lesson in kindness, patience, and humanity, and it was unforgettable. Days turned into weeks, and the child continued to thrive. School became a place of accomplishment rather than struggle. They joined small clubs, participated in class activities, and even began helping younger students who needed assistance. Confidence grew in every aspect of life, fueled by the knowledge that someone had cared enough to make things better. It was a ripple effect that started with a single act of kindness. The community began to notice the change as well. Neighbors commented on how the child moved with ease and confidence. Teachers spoke of the child's improved engagement and participation. Even strangers passing by could see the difference. What had started as a small act in a quiet workshop was now creating waves beyond the walls of the workshop, touching lives in subtle but meaningful ways. The child's dreams grew as well. Simple goals that had once seemed impossible now felt attainable. They imagined traveling to nearby towns, visiting friends independently, and even exploring new hobbies that required mobility. The world no longer felt limited. The chair had become a symbol of possibility, and the mechanic's kindness was the reason it all seemed possible. Every turn of the wheel reminded the child of hope, care, and the importance of small acts of generosity. One evening, after a long day at school, the child returned home and found the parent waiting. They shared stories of the day, laughing about small adventures, proud of accomplishments, and planning for the next. The child paused, thinking about the mechanic and the gift he had given. It wasn't just the chair. It was the opportunity to move, explore, participate, and grow. It was freedom. The parent listened and nodded, understanding without words. They had watched the transformation, felt the relief and joy, and knew that something extraordinary had happened. It was a quiet miracle, born not from wealth, fame, or grand gestures, but from simple, patient, human kindness. It was the kind of change that could not be measured in material terms, only in the growth of confidence, independence, and hope. In the workshop, the mechanic continued his work, unaware of the lasting impact he had created. Old bikes, rusty parts, and broken machines filled the space. Yet each repair he made carried meaning beyond the metal. Each small fix could change a life, sometimes without him even realizing it. And in this case, his work had done exactly that. The child's life was no longer defined by struggle or limitation. It was defined by possibility, growth, and the knowledge that someone had cared. Every day became a little easier, every path a little more accessible, and every challenge a little less daunting. The wheels moved smoothly, the body moved confidently, and the mind dreamed freely. What had been a simple act of repair had become a bridge to a new life. And so, life continued, filled with small victories and quiet moments of joy. The child rolled through streets, classrooms, and playgrounds with confidence. The parent watched with pride. The mechanic worked silently in his corner, never knowing the full story. But one thing was certain. A simple act of help had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had changed a life, created hope, and opened the door to a future filled with possibilities that were once out of reach. The small wheelchair, now strong and steady, became more than a chair. It was a symbol of what kindness, patience, and human care could do. And in the heart of a child, it became the key to a life no longer limited by struggle but defined by freedom and hope. The news of the child's new wheelchair and the freedom it brought didn't stay hidden for long. It started quietly, with teachers talking to each other about how easily the child now moved through the school, how confident they had become, and how their participation in class had increased. The other children noticed too, and soon, small whispers and curious questions began to spread throughout the school. Who helped them? Their wheelchair moves so well now. It's like magic. The child listened to the chatter but didn't fully understand the impact at first. They only knew that moving around felt easier, and life had become brighter. One day, during lunch, a classmate asked, "Did someone fix your chair for you?" The child nodded, their eyes lighting up as they thought about the kind mechanic who had helped. "Yes," they said softly. "A man at the workshop. He fixed it for me." The classmate smiled, impressed. "Wow, that's amazing. You're really lucky." The child felt a small wave of pride but also a deep gratitude that was hard to put into words. It wasn't just luck. It was kindness, patience, and care that had made all the difference. Word spread beyond the school. Neighbors who had once seen the child struggle now noticed the smooth movements, the independence, and the confidence that had returned. Some would wave from their porches. Others would nod in quiet acknowledgement as the child rolled past. Even strangers passing through town could see the difference. It was subtle, but the change was noticeable. The child's world had expanded, and people began to notice that something meaningful had happened. The small act of fixing a wheelchair had turned into a story of hope and transformation. At home, the parent began to realize the extent of the change. Daily routines that had once been exhausting now felt manageable. Mornings were calmer, evenings more relaxed, and there was less worry about safety and movement. The child now helped with small chores, reaching objects on shelves and carrying light items. Life had shifted in quiet but powerful ways, and the parent often thought about the mechanic, wishing they could thank him properly. They wanted him to understand the ripple effect of his actions, the way a single act of kindness could change not just one day but the trajectory of a life. Curiosity and gratitude led the child to ask if they could visit the mechanic's workshop again. One afternoon, after school, the parent accompanied them to the small, familiar space. The workshop smelled of metal, oil, and the faint warmth of years of hard work. The mechanic looked up, wiping his hands on a rag, and greeted them with a gentle smile. "Back again?" he asked. The child nodded, their heart full. "I wanted to say thank you," they said softly. "It's made such a big difference." The mechanic shrugged modestly. "It was nothing," he said, but his eyes betrayed a quiet satisfaction. He could see the change, the confidence, the independence, the joy that radiated from the child. To him, it had been a simple act of repair, but to the child, it had been life-changing. The child rolled the wheelchair forward and back, showing him how smooth it was now. The mechanic watched closely, a faint smile forming. He didn't need praise or recognition. Seeing the result was enough. As the weeks passed, the child's story began to touch others in the community. Friends, neighbors, and teachers were inspired by the simple act of kindness. Some visited the workshop just to thank the mechanic. Others were motivated to help in their own ways, quietly assisting neighbors, fixing broken items, or offering support to those in need. The ripple effect of one small gesture was spreading, creating a culture of care and attention that went beyond the child's immediate life. People began to see that even simple acts could have profound consequences. At school, the child continued to thrive. They participated in more activities, joined clubs, and even helped classmates who struggled with small tasks. Teachers noticed a marked improvement not only in mobility but also in confidence, engagement, and happiness. The child began to speak more in class, contribute to discussions, and express thoughts and ideas that had once been held back. It was as if a small door had been opened, and the child was stepping into a world of possibility. The playground became a place of joy rather than intimidation. The child could navigate spaces that had once been difficult, joining games, turning corners, and moving freely among peers. Children who had previously kept their distance now included the child in activities, curious about the new freedom and eager to share moments of play. Laughter filled the air, and the child's smile became more frequent, more genuine. The wheelchair, once a symbol of struggle, had become a symbol of independence and opportunity. The parent watched all of this with a mixture of pride, relief, and deep gratitude. They had worried for so long about the child's daily challenges, about the obstacles that seemed to appear at every turn. Now those worries were lessened, replaced by hope and joy. The child's growth was evident not only in physical movement but in emotional resilience and confidence. The parent often reflected on the mechanic's role in this transformation, wishing the man could see the full impact of what he had done. One day, the school held a small assembly, and the child's story came up. Teachers spoke about how acts of kindness could change lives and used the child's experience as an example. Students listened intently, inspired by the notion that small gestures could have powerful effects. The child sat quietly, listening, feeling both embarrassed and proud. They didn't fully understand the attention but felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the mechanic, whose quiet actions had sparked this chain of events. The mechanic, meanwhile, continued his work quietly in his workshop. He repaired bikes, fixed broken tools, and helped neighbors with small mechanical problems. To him, life remained simple, ordinary, and unremarkable. He didn't seek attention, recognition, or thanks. But unknowingly, he had become a hero in the eyes of a child, a parent, and a growing community. His small act had grown into something larger, touching lives in ways he would never fully realize. The child's confidence continued to grow. They began imagining new possibilities, visiting new places independently, exploring hobbies that required mobility, and participating in community events. The world no longer felt restrictive. They could see opportunities where once there had been barriers. Each movement of the wheels reminded the child of hope, care, and the human capacity for kindness. Every day became a chance to explore, learn, and grow in ways that had once seemed impossible. Neighbors and friends began to talk about the mechanic. Some came to visit him, bringing small gifts or words of thanks. Others shared the story with friends and family, inspired by the idea that one small act could create such a profound ripple. The workshop, once overlooked, became a place of quiet reverence. People respected the man's work not for the tools or the mechanical skill but for the care and attention he gave to those in need. The parent and child continued to visit when they could, bringing small tokens of gratitude or simply sharing stories of progress and success. The child would roll around the workshop, testing the wheelchair, showing the mechanic how far they could go, and recounting small victories at school and in the neighborhood. The mechanic listened, smiling quietly, acknowledging without words the difference that careful, thoughtful action could make. Life settled into a rhythm. The child moved more freely, participated fully, and embraced new experiences. The parents saw a transformation not only in mobility but in personality, confidence, and resilience. The small community began to understand that even minor gestures of care could create lasting impact. The story of a broken wheelchair, a quiet mechanic, and a grateful child became a living example of human compassion and the profound effects it could have. Even as months passed, the lessons remained. The child learned to be independent, to help others, and to appreciate the kindness that had been shown to them. The parent felt relief, pride, and a deep understanding that sometimes life's challenges could be eased through the care of others. And the mechanic, continuing his work quietly in his small workshop, remained unaware of the full extent of the life he had changed. Yet, the effect of his kindness spread farther than he could see, influencing not just the child's life but the attitudes and hearts of an entire community. The small act of fixing a chair had grown into a story of hope, kindness, and human connection. It showed that simple actions could ripple outward, inspiring others and creating change in ways no one could predict. The child's life, once constrained by struggle, had been opened to possibility. The parent, once burdened by worry, could see a brighter path ahead, and the mechanic, unknowingly, had sparked a chain of events that would touch lives far beyond what he had imagined. In this way, the community learned a quiet truth, that kindness, patience, and attention to small needs could create ripples that extended far beyond the initial act. The story of a single child, a small wheelchair, and a mechanic's thoughtful care became a symbol of hope and humanity. It reminded everyone that even in simple, ordinary actions, there could be extraordinary results. The gift of mobility, freedom, and confidence had become more than a repair. It had become a living example of how humans could make life better for each other, one small act at a time. The days and weeks that followed the child's first visit to the workshop became a turning point in life. Each morning, the child rolled through the streets with confidence, the wheels of the wheelchair moving smoothly, carrying not only their body but also a newfound sense of freedom. Life had changed in ways that went beyond the ability to move easily. It was as if every small struggle that had once defined the day had been replaced by a quiet strength. The child now approached tasks with determination, knowing that they could succeed even when challenges appeared. At school, the transformation continued. The teachers noticed not just improved mobility, but also a change in attitude. The child raised their hand more often in class, spoke with a voice that was clearer and more confident, and participated actively in activities that had previously seemed impossible. Friends began to treat the child differently, not with pity, but with respect. They laughed together on the playground, shared secrets, and included the child in games and projects. The child had entered a world that had once felt inaccessible, and each day brought new opportunities to explore and grow. Back at home, the parent watched these changes with a mix of pride, relief, and deep gratitude. Mornings were easier now. The child could prepare for school with minimal help, moving with independence and confidence. Chores that had once been small battles now became routine, and in quiet moments, the parent would reflect on the kindness of the mechanic, wondering if he could ever fully understand the difference he had made. It was more than fixing a chair. It was giving the child the ability to live fully, to participate, and to hope. One weekend, the parent and child decided to visit the workshop again. They wanted to see the man who had done so much and to offer their thanks once more. The small workshop, filled with tools and spare parts, welcomed them as always. The mechanic looked up from a bike he was repairing, smiled, and wiped his hands on a rag. "Back again," he said quietly. The child nodded, rolling closer. "I wanted to thank you again," the child said softly. "You've changed my life." The mechanic shrugged, trying to appear modest. "I just fixed your chair," he said. But the child could see in his eyes that he understood the weight of what had been done. He didn't need praise. The act itself, the result, was reward enough. The child demonstrated how easily the wheelchair moved, showing him how far they could go without struggle. The mechanic watched carefully, smiling quietly, as if he was sharing in the joy of that freedom. Word of the mechanic's kindness began to spread more broadly. Teachers mentioned the story during meetings, neighbors shared it on small community boards, and other children talked about it in school. People were inspired by the idea that one small act of care could have such a profound effect. It encouraged others to act with kindness, to pay attention to the needs of those around them, and to help where they could, even in small ways. The mechanic's simple generosity had become a ripple that touched the lives of many. At school, the child's life continued to improve. They began joining clubs and activities that had once seemed out of reach. Art, reading circles, and even small sports events became accessible. The wheelchair, once a symbol of limitation, had transformed into a symbol of possibility. Every turn of its wheels was a reminder of care, patience, and human kindness. And with every passing day, the child's confidence grew, not just in movement, but in thinking, speaking, and interacting with the world. The parent often reflected on the change with quiet pride. Watching the child grow stronger, more independent, and happier was a daily source of joy. The child's laughter now filled the home more often, and conversations were richer, filled with ideas, dreams, and plans. It was hard to imagine life before the workshop visit, before the mechanic had lent his hands and heart to help. The change was not just physical. It was emotional, mental, and spiritual. The mechanic, meanwhile, continued his work quietly. He repaired bikes, tools, and machines that came into his small shop. To him, life remained simple, ordinary, and filled with routine tasks. He did not seek recognition or thanks. But the effect of his actions spread far beyond the walls of his workshop. Every person touched by the child's newfound confidence carried the story further, inspiring others to act with care and attention. Small acts of kindness multiplied, creating a network of compassion in the community. The child's dreams began to expand in ways that had once seemed impossible. They imagined visiting new places, exploring hobbies, and learning skills that required mobility and independence. Every new experience was a test of confidence, but the child approached it with courage, knowing that someone had cared enough to make this possible. Each success, each small victory, reinforced the belief that life was full of opportunities waiting to be embraced. Neighbors noticed too. People who had once assumed the child's struggles were permanent began to see a different reality. The child moved freely, participated actively in the neighborhood, and shared moments of joy with friends and peers. Adults admired the progress, but more importantly, children learned lessons of resilience, determination, and gratitude. The community began to understand that support, attention, and small acts of kindness could change lives in ways that were profound and lasting. One afternoon, the parents shared with the child how proud they were. "Look at what you can do now," they said softly. "You've grown so much, and it's because someone believed in you enough to help. But you've also learned something important. You can help others too." The child nodded, thinking deeply. They had experienced the power of care firsthand, and now they felt the desire to extend that same kindness to others. Small gestures, gentle help, and attention to the needs of others could make a difference, just as it had for them. As time went on, the child began helping other students, offering guidance, and assisting friends who needed support. They shared stories of their journey, explaining how one person's quiet generosity had changed their life. Other children were inspired, learning that even small acts could have a large impact. The workshop, once an ordinary space in the town, became a symbol of hope. The mechanic's work, unseen by many, had started a chain of kindness that touched countless lives. At home, life had shifted as well. The parent noticed the child's independence, resilience, and growing compassion. Daily challenges no longer felt overwhelming. The child could navigate spaces, communicate needs, and even take initiative in household tasks. Confidence had blossomed in every area of life, and the parent often reflected on the quiet power of one human act. It was a reminder that the simplest gestures could hold enormous meaning. The child's world expanded further. School events, visits to friends, and community gatherings all became accessible and enjoyable. No longer limited by mobility, the child experienced the joy of participation fully. Each outing was a chance to test abilities, learn new things, and interact confidently with the environment. The parent noticed not only the physical growth, but also the emotional and social development that had been sparked by the mechanic's kindness. The mechanic remained humble, unaware of the full impact of his work. He continued to repair bicycles, machines, and tools, treating every task with care and patience. But the small act of repairing a wheelchair had already created ripples far beyond what he could see. The child's life had changed, the parent's burdens had eased, and the community had learned lessons in compassion and humanity. Small gestures had proven their power to inspire, uplift, and transform. The child never forgot the mechanic. They thought about him often, remembering the care, patience, and attention that had gone into fixing the wheelchair. Every time they rolled smoothly through the streets or classroom, they remembered that act of kindness and how it had given them a chance to grow. It became a lesson that they carried in their heart, that one person's quiet generosity could ignite a change far greater than anyone could imagine. Years passed, and the child grew stronger, more confident, and more independent. School achievements, friendships, and personal milestones marked a life that had been open to possibilities that once seemed distant. The parent continued to support and guide, but the foundation of growth had been laid in that small workshop. A simple act of fixing a chair had transformed into freedom, confidence, and hope for the future. The workshop remained, quiet and humble, filled with tools and machines waiting for repair. The mechanic carried on as always, unaware of the profound effect of his actions. Yet, in that quiet space, he had planted the seeds of change, seeds that had blossomed in a child, a parent, and a growing community. Kindness had multiplied, courage had been nurtured, and hope had been restored. The story of the child and the mechanic became an example that others shared. People spoke of how one act of care could change a life. Teachers, neighbors, and friends recognized that compassion, patience, and attention to small needs had the power to inspire. The ripple effect continued, spreading quietly through conversations, actions, and shared experiences. It was a living proof that ordinary people, through simple gestures, could create extraordinary impact. The child continued to dream, to explore, and to grow. Every turn of the wheelchair wheels reminded them of hope and kindness. Every smile, every small success, and every moment of independence carried the memory of someone who had taken the time to care. The parent watched with pride, gratitude, and a deep sense of awe at how a single act of generosity had shaped an entire life. And in the small workshop, the mechanic carried on, focused on his work. He might never fully understand the lives he had touched, the confidence he had restored, or the inspiration he had sparked. But his simple act, his patience, his skill, and his willingness to help, had created ripples that transformed not only a child's life but the lives of many who witnessed and were inspired by the change. It was a quiet, powerful truth, that sometimes the smallest acts of care could change everything. Freedom, confidence, and hope could be given through simple gestures. Life could be transformed through patience and kindness. And the child, once limited by struggle, now thrived in a world full of possibilities, carrying the memory of generosity and the lesson that one person's small help can indeed change a life forever. The parent, the child, and even the community knew, without needing to say it aloud, that the impact of that workshop, that chair, and that quiet mechanic would last a lifetime. And the child, rolling smoothly down the streets, felt a deep, enduring gratitude, not just for the chair, but for the simple human kindness that had opened a world full of hope.